Welcome to the first class of our online conference, Researching English Eastern Canada. Eastern Canada is an important region of study for many Americans, tracing their family history. Loyalists fled to Eastern Canada during the American Revolution. Many immigrants first settled in Eastern Canada before coming to the U.S. Farmers and tradesmen made several border crossings following economic opportunities and the harvest. And of course, other ancestors may have stayed in Eastern Canada for generations. In this online conference, you'll hear from 5 experts as they discuss the settlement history, records, resources, repositories, and research strategies for tracing ancestors in Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, Ontario, and Newfoundland. In this first class, Chief Genealogist David Allen Lambert will discuss Nova Scotia family history research. David has been on the staff of NEHGS since 1993 and is the organization's chief genealogist. David is an internationally recognized speaker on the topics of genealogy and history. He has published many articles in the New England Historical and Genealogical Register, the New Hampshire Genealogical Record, Rhode Island Roots, the Mayflower Descendant, and American Ancestors magazine. He is also the author of A Guide to Massachusetts Cemeteries. His genealogical expertise includes New England and Atlantic Canadian records of the 17th through 21st centuries, military records, DNA research, and Native American and African American genealogical research in New England. Please welcome David Allen Lambert.
Hello, everyone, and I am honored to be here with you today virtually to talk about a place I love, the home of my ancestors, Nova Scotia. Now, the history of Nova Scotia can be traced back tens to thousands of years ago when the settlement of the Mi'kmaq Indians appear on the landscape. Now, the Mi'kmaq would be, of course, greeted by Europeans, and I don't mean the French or the English, I mean, of course, the Norse, as we believe that the Norse had settled unsuccessfully, but had traveled the areas of Cape Breton and other parts of Atlantic Canada of Nova Scotia. Now, in 1605, the French start the settlement of Acadia, and that is encompassing what is now, of course, modern-day New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Nova Scotia. In 1621, however, King James I of England will give the name New Scotland, or in Latin, Nova Scotia, to the peninsula that you see in front of you on this 20th century map. Now, unfortunately, Nova Scotia was granted to Sir William Alexander, but Alexander's successful idea of colonizing Nova Scotia did not work out. And of course, it became predominantly the stronghold of the Acadian settlement for so long. And if you look here, this is Acadia in 1754. You have a variety of the different settlements that are there. In 1713, however, after battles between the 17th century and early part, the Treaty of Utrecht basically ended Acadia, if you will, as a French colony. It would basically be transferred over to the British, and the only part of Acadia at that point would be Ile Royale, we know now as Cape Breton. With the exception of Ile Royale and Ile Saint-Jean, which would become Prince Edward Island. My colleague Melanie McComb will be lecturing about that later. These are the last strongholds for the Acadians. Now, it does not mean that there were not Acadian families that stayed on. In fact, there are descendants of the families till the 21st century still in these regions, but the majority of them would be, unfortunately, removed. And we'll talk a little bit about that now. Now, the Acadians first settled the area of the colony 1604, 1605, where you start to see forts are set up there. And of course, again, it is the entranceway into the St. Lawrence, where you would find in modern day Quebec of the cities of Quebec City and Montreal. This is where you're going to find the major settlements of the French. However, on Cape Breton Island, or Cape Breton, as it would also be called, is the Fortress Louisbourg. As you can see on the far right-hand side, this section is right where the fortress was, and this would be, of course, the spot of major battles in the 18th century. Now, Acadians, again, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. In fact, New Brunswick was actually part of Nova Scotia until the 1780s. So just a bit of an overview. So 1713, Acadia Colony was now under British rule. By 1749, some of the Acadian population was moved into the French territory. So basically, you find some of them moving into Quebec. You also find some that even went back actually to France, now that the property is being now under British rule. The remaining Acadians refused to swear allegiance to the King of England and claimed neutrality in any conflict between Britain and France. Now, the problem is that if an Acadian swore an allegiance to the King of England, they also had to give up their Roman Catholic faith and follow the Church of England. That would be something tough to swallow when you figure you're, besides now losing the sovereignty of your own king, you're now having to follow that king's religion. Now, the Great Upheaval, this is when we find the displacement of the Acadians. If you ever read Longfellow's L'Evangeline, this is essentially the removal of the Acadians from what we have now as Nova Scotia. In 1755, British Governor Charles Lawrence met with Acadian delegates and pressed them to take an unqualified oath of allegiance to Britain. Remember, this oath also is removing their ability to practice as Roman Catholics. The Acadians refused and were imprisoned, and the order of deportation was now issued. Now, some of the Acadians actually went off to Quebec. Some of them went back to France. In fact, some of them even went to New England as French neutrals that were neutral between being one way or the other on the side of being French loyal. And some of them settled actually in New England. And of course, others would go down to the area of New Orleans and be part of the Cajun culture. Now, the deportation systematically deported 6,000 Acadians to these American colonies in England and in France. Now, after the fall of Louisbourg in 1758, 3,000 remaining Acadians exiled to France. Those were also part of the military strength of France. So a lot of them going back would be just basically troops were moving back and their associated families. By 1765, 1,600 Acadians remained in Nova Scotia. Now, this is where the New England planters come in. Now, you figure here is the colony of Acadia, now Nova Scotia, under British rule. You have farms, you have crops, you have livestock, but no occupants. Well, a small amount of British soldiers are not going to be able to take care of all of this. So ads were run in New England papers asking for settlers, and settlers came from the New England colonies and responded to these invitations by the Nova Scotian government to settle this now vacant land. You can't imagine the amount of New Englanders who were probably not going to inherit their father's farm, being maybe the youngest son, have now this opportunity for free land. 8,000 planters arrived from New England between 1759 and 1768. And a lot of the farmers settled in what is now the Annapolis Valley. It was a very rich farming area as well. Fishermen also settled in the South Shore along the coast, because obviously here is a lot of settlers from New England that were Cape Cod fishermen, and they knew how rich the fishing banks off of Nova Scotia were. Now, one of the collections that we have on American ancestors is New Englanders in Nova Scotia. Now, this collection has over 48,000 names, and it consists of the stories and genealogical records of 650 families from New England, and also some of the loyalists who would come up later to settle in Nova Scotia. This is work done by Fred E. Crowell, and it was done back in the 1920s and 1930s. It's published in the Yarmouth Herald. And all of his extensive research notes and manuscripts, as well as all the newspaper articles, are included in the New Englanders and Nova Scotia collection. And all this material was donated to NEHGS over 40 years ago. Originally, we have it on microfilm. Now we have it for you on our website. This is an example of some of the handwritten records that Crowell put together. As you can see, there's the Blackmer to Blackmore family, and then he jumps down to family 493, the Lyon family. It's really nice to actually have it on American Ancestors. I can remember in the days where we had to scroll through it, it was very hard to follow the index, especially if there are names associated within. Primarily, we had a guide to know that number 492 is the Blackmere family, 493 is the Lyon family, etc. But we didn't have an every name index. Now we do. And it covers both the family as planters and loyalists, as well as some of their lineage going back to the immigrant in New England. So you can be certain if you have the right line. In some cases, people of Nova Scotian ancestry have now discovered their New England connections doing it reverse. Now, the United Empire Loyalists, or UEL, were the American colonists who remained loyal to the British Crown during the American Revolutionary War. Now, some of them served the British during the American Revolutionary War, and these United Empire Loyalist troops would often get Crown land given to them. Now, I think they had intended on staying in the 13 colonies. However, that did not end so well for the British, as we know, with the American Revolution. So when the British troops left, the United Empire Loyalists also left, having been now the target of their neighbors as they had turned to the side of the king and not to the rebel cause. So approximately 36,000 American Loyalists came to Nova Scotia during and immediately following the American Revolutionary War. And you can find certain settlements like in Shelburne, Nova Scotia, which were heavily settled by Loyalists, and they were given Crown land and also worked to get their losses for lost property in America that they had essentially had seized by the rebel forces or the new American government. The colony of New Brunswick created approximately for the purpose of a settlement. In fact, St. John took the bulk of them in, and there were 14,000 who settled there. And again, this was previously Nova Scotia. It becomes, after the end of the Revolutionary War, New Brunswick. Now, there are also other settlers. I'd like to talk briefly about the Scottish settlers. Presbyterian Scots arrived first in Nova Scotia, of course, after the British rule. Ironically, 150 years before, Sir William Alexander had the grant of New Scotland, but it wouldn't be until the 1770s that you start to see the first of the Scottish settlers. They come over on the ship Hector and settle in Pictou. Cape Breton itself is very heavily Scottish, as this was a settlement that was done in 1775 at the start of our American Revolutionary War, and this was led by Michael MacDonald. The landscape of Cape Breton and along the Cabot Trail is very much similar to the settlement of the Highlands in Scotland, and you find a lot of them felt very much at home there, and it is still a stronghold of those with Scottish heritage to this day. Late in the 1700s, Roman Catholic families from the Hebrides, islands like Benbecula, would settle into Cape Breton, Nova Scotia as well, founding areas right around the city, what is now the city of Sydney, Nova Scotia. After 1820, more Scottish families came to Nova Scotia following what are called the clearances, when the landlords in Scotland evicted mass evictions of the tenants, and they went to the New World. In this case, they went to New Scotland. My own ancestors were Irish settlers that came into Nova Scotia in the 1790s, probably from the Waterford area. Now, there are earlier settlements in the area, starting back as early as 1749 that we know of. We know the two groups, the Catholics from the southeastern Ireland, from the counties of Wexford, Carlisle, Waterford, Kilkenny, and Tipperary. And most of them settled in the areas of Halifax Guysborough, and Antigonish counties. Now, Presbyterian Irish from Northern Ireland in the 1760s also came into the area. My great-great-grandmother's people are from Donegal, and that's one of the counties we're settling in the areas of Cumberland County, for instance. And these people are predominantly from Donegal, Tyrone, and Londonderry. And as you saw, complete control of the property of Nova Scotia by the British, you would see more Scottish and more Irish come in. Now, there are also other groups, just to discuss. The Germans settle in the area of Lunenburg. You find them coming in right around the same time as you do the planters. You also find people from a very interesting part of the world. I have one set of ancestors that I knew their name initially as Jonah, but their real last name was Jonet. The reason they chose Jonah because it was more of an English sounding name. They came from an area near France and Switzerland's border, an area called Montbéliard. And so these Montbéliard settlers came in because, one, they could speak French, but they weren't loyal to the French king. And they would go in there and be able to work as interpreters and work alongside those Acadians that stayed behind, as well as they were new settlers in the region. So I have ancestors from Montbéliard, a very small region, and there was a very good book written by Terence Punch on settlers from Montbéliard. Again, Nova Scotia, like any eastern seaboard, would eventually see immigrants from all parts of the globe, including with the Loyalist group. We have African Americans who were part of the Loyalist groups that went up there. So you find early African American families as well. This is just the start. Halifax and other ports growing as very big places for immigrants to come in, would see people from all over Europe to arrive by the 19th century. Now, I'm just going to give a little quick overview, and you can go back to this video if you need sort of a primer, if you will, on counties of modern Nova Scotia. Here's a general map of Nova Scotia. In the upper right, we have Cape Breton. This is going to be where you actually have a separate colony until 1827. As before the Confederation, we had Nova Scotia, and then you had Cape Breton as its own colony. Now, the original county, of course, is going to be in Halifax, and that occurs in 1749. And that is where, of course, the British Army stronghold will be. You'll also find that the split from Halifax will occur in 1759, and you'll get counties such as Annapolis, Cumberland, Kings, and Lunenburg. Lunenburg being where the German settlement would be. Cumberland, you'll find Irish settlements early on as well in that region. By 1762, you have a split, and that creates Queens County, and then you also have Hants County in 1781 during the midst of the Revolutionary War. In 1784, you see creation of Shelburne. That is a very large county that would be settled by Loyalists. You also see Antigonish as a county as well. That's going to be up there right by the border of Cape Breton. And until 1820, not 1827, I stand corrected on that, is when Cape Breton will be a separate colony. And that will be its own county and then break down even further. In 1835, you now have the counties of Colchester, Inverness, Pictou, and Richmond. 1836, a year later, you get Guysborough and Yarmouth. So using this in mind, remember that every time you're looking for deeds, as we'll talk about those that are available both at NEHGS and on Family Search, you want to remember the date in which the deed is recorded, because your ancestors' land may have fallen in a different county earlier than when you first start looking for them when they sell the property. When they purchased it, it may have been a completely different county. So in 1837, we have Digby County, 1851, Victoria, named for Queen Victoria of England. And we're going to start first with church records. Now, because we'll learn about vital records in Nova Scotia, of course, the first thing we start seeing is the settlement of churches and the recording of records. But where do you find them? So on Nova Scotia, there are so many databases on Family Search. I'm hoping that we'll cover every single one in enough detail for you, but I want you to still investigate in the catalog under the county in Nova Scotia where your family is, because you're going to find all sorts of wonderful databases. Some of them have already been transcribed for you, including the over 16,000 names in the Nova Scotia church record 1720 to 2001, and this includes some of the Acadian churches as well. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just go in, and here's all the listing of my counties. And when you're looking for church records, keep in mind, even though the county may have not existed until the current date, church records are going to be filed together by what the county that the church is currently residing in. It's a little different with probates and deeds because of its boundaries. But in the case of church records, I'm going to look for churches in Cumberland County where my family lived. From there, I'm going to go a little bit further, and I'm going to select one of the towns in Cumberland County. And now I have in the village of Parsborough, the Catholic church records for St. Bridget. So I can find baptisms, marriages, and burials. So I'll select one of these. And if you're familiar with Family Search, you know that it's like a film strip. They basically have taken and digitized microfilm, or in some cases, the records are now been digitized and you're not dealing with microfilm, but digital images that were done from the beginning. So they did not go out and take all the film and convert it over. They've done that for most of them, but for newer things, they're done straight as digital copies. So let's take a peek at one of these, if we will. Click on the image, and then I can find the baptism of 1877 from St. Bridget's for these baptisms here. And this is a church in Amherst, which is the county seat in Cumberland County. Now, Acadian church records are also available. Some of these have not been digitized yet, but the 8 reels of microfilm here in this collection cover Acadian churches from 1732 to 1955. Again, of course, the Acadian culture may have been replaced by the British settlement, but they still had churches, and a lot of times the churches would stop. Sometimes they picked up again and they continued on. So some of the churches are long since running, and you find these for over 200 years for a variety of parishes. Now, another place you want to look at the Nova Scotia archives, and I put the URL down below under archive.novascotia.ca. You can search for what church records are at the Nova Scotia archives. Unlike a lot of places around the world, Family Search has got in and done some great microfilming from archives or churches. In Nova Scotia, it's a little different. You have to actually find that Family Search doesn't have it, and then you want to make a little further look and see if the Nova Scotian Archives does have it. In a lot of cases, churches never granted permission to Family Search to do the filming or digitization, but they did grant the Nova Scotia Archives to microfilm them. So you can find these records in Halifax at the Nova Scotia Archives. They're not digitized online yet, but you can find out what exists. So let's take a look at the catalog where we can put in a name of a place down here. I did a search under the village of McCann, where my family lived in Cumberland County, and was able to find out that they had 6 reels of microfilm that spanned the 1820s to the 1960s. And that would be of interest to me, because besides having confirmations and sermon registers, there have the minutes and vestry meetings, which may mention my ancestors involved in the church. Essentially becomes a quasi-census because I can see where they are. The nice thing about the catalog is it also gives you the associated villages that would be connected to that church. So if they covered a church that covers like 5 or 6 different communities or more, you'll find them right here. So I'm able to go into a further click into that, and it now gives me exactly what reel I need for the different things like burial registers and confirmation and marriages. Great stuff. Again, you're going to either need to go to Nova Scotia. We've done research tours there in the past, and I hope that we continue to look at Atlantic Canada for in-person research in the future, or you'd need to hire somebody there. Unfortunately, these films are not digitized, and again, they're not Family Search microfilm, nor are they on Ancestry.com or anything online currently. So you have to do in-person research to look at these. Now, because Nova Scotia was settled by New Englanders, the traditions of recording New England town records was carried through and done in Nova Scotia. Now, not every community has a township book, but if they did, there are microfilms and in most cases been digitized, the volumes that do exist. I find the township books are great because they're town records. They have both the vital records of the family, as you can see here, going back into the 18th century, as well as land records, cattle marks, different things, taxes, votes of the town committee that might have your ancestor's name on it. So you know that by his cattle mark, this is the first time he shows up in the community. This is the case with my own wife's ancestor in the Horton Township books. I know that Patrick Nowlin is first there, not by a deed, not by a vital record, but a registered cattle mark in 1792. Now, if you want to see what township records are at the Nova Scotia Archives, I know of one village in particular that had a township book, so I'm going to search on Southampton in Cumberland County. I'll put it in and I'll hit search under the magnifying glass here. And it tells me there are 2 reels of film and that they have birth, marriages, and deaths. It has minutes and meetings of the town, and it contains a variety of different things, including records of overseers of the poor, which would be of some interest as well. Now, again, the township records, NEHGS has done a great effort to purchase as much microfilm as we possibly can. Robert Hendrickson's generosity has allowed us to spend over $100,000 in the past 20 years to purchase what microfilm we can from the Nova Scotia Archives. So even though this microfilm may not be at Family Search or online, if you come to American Ancestors, we'll be able to show you a majority of these microfilm. Now, in the Family Search catalog, if you want to see which ones Family Search may have microfilmed, not all of them have been done by Family Search. I would simply put in a catalog search, Nova Scotia, Canada, and then put in the keywords Nova Scotia Township and see what you get and hit search. So for instance, in the township of Southampton, I click on that. I'm going to do a specific search, and then I'm going to hit search. It tells me that they do have their own filming of the township of Southampton, which has birth, marriages, and deaths. And these records run roughly 1764 to 1851. And now, because that was filmed by Family Search, and with NEHGS currently being closed and the Nova Scotia Archives being currently closed, I can search this at the convenience of whenever I wish at home through my Family Search account that I have. The Nova Scotia Township books that we do have on microfilm include the following towns of Annapolis, Argyll, Aylesford, Chester, Cornwallis, Digby, Douglas, Falmouth, Fort Lawrence, Granville, Horton, Liverpool, Londonderry, McCann, Manchester, New Dublin, Newport, Parsborough, River Phillip, St. Mary's, Stormont, Truro, Tuscott, Westchester, Wilmot, Windsor, and Yarmouth. We are also continuously adding to our collection. So by the time you come to NEHGS again, we may even have more. So let's talk about vital records in Nova Scotia next. In Nova Scotia, vital records on a civil registered level did not begin until 1864 for birth, marriages, and death. And I'll talk a little bit about each one of those as we go into the particular topic. There are earlier records. There are delayed registrations of birth that were recorded as early as 1830s, as well as marriage bonds that go as early as 1763. These marriage bonds predate the marriages recorded in the civil records by 100 years. Now, births and deaths were recorded, as you can see from this chart here, between 1864 and 1877. Then there's a gap, 31-year gap, in fact, that goes not again recording births and deaths until 1908. So that makes it very hard for genealogists to narrow down births. And I'll show you a case study at the end for my own great-grandfather, which he was born before the record started. What could I use? Well, I'll show you. So the website novascotiagenealogy.com basically will allow you to do a search. However, they will want you to purchase the image. You will notice when you're using their zoom in and zoom out that you'll never get the whole image that you could sort of capture without purchasing it. Their images are very good. However, there are some that you can find on Family Search, and I'll show you how to do that as well. When you go onto the Nova Scotia genealogy site, you're going to put in your search, then it's going to ask you to go through the terms and conditions. This is going to come up to every time that you do your first search. Once you scroll to the bottom, you agree to their policies, and you can go forward. So let's look first at marriage bonds, 1763 to 1864, the century before the records are actually kept for marriages by the county. So I'm going to do a search here in the marriage bonds. I'm going to go back in here and I'm going to put in the last name, and then I'm going to put in a first name, and you can click off the boxes that you want. You can have all three, but in this case, you really should probably try to just narrow it down to what you're looking for, especially if it's a very common name. And then I'm going to hit search. If I look here into the marriages, I have 122 matches because I've narrowed down just for marriage searching. And I look in here, and sure enough, there's a marriage bond for my great-great-grandparents that I initially didn't know when I first started my research. I remembered seeing this and thinking, I said, well, I'm going to start gathering up every Lambert I can in different counties that I suspected we came from. So I can go and I can view this record, or I can add it to my shopping cart. And then I'm going to hit search once I've got that one mapped out. And what it shows me is that on record book 1800 page, image 5069, there's the actual marriage bond, and this is for John Lambert of McCann, bachelor, and Margaret McDade of the same place. So this is the 1824 marriage bond for my great-great-grandparents. Now I can view it in the cart and purchase a copy. They're all in color, which is nice because you can see the different non-sepia images here. And of course, if they have seals on them, it's even nicer. Or you can just kind of browse through, determine if this is the right one, make notes from it, so you technically can do research from them. It's just that you can't right-click and save the image itself. Now, again, births, there's that gap of 31 years. And there are also delayed births. Now, the delayed births, from what I have noticed, are primarily done after 1908. These are people that were living in 1908 that just never got around to having their birth recorded. And it does catch some of the 1878 to 1907 births, but not a lot. So when you do your birth search in this collection, I decided to look for more of my Lamberts, and I found that this was a birth recorded for a Hugh Lambert. Now, that is the nephew of my great-grandfather, and it's his birth in 1855, so it's the earliest of all the Lambert births. So I thought I would take a peek at that. because this one obviously is in the late recorded births because it's 9 years before civil registration starts. So here I find in here the registration back in 1904 for Hugh Lambert, recording that he was born in February 21st, 1855, and it goes into naming his parents and gives the place of birth of his parents as well. And this is really nice, and it has a sworn affidavit that this was actually from a family Bible record, which I am still looking for. But this is a copy of the late registration. Again, you can zoom right into it. Now, that being said, there are some of these images that are available through Family Search. If I go to Nova Scotia Delayed Births, a database on FamilySearch.org, the date is a little different. On the Nova Scotia Archives, NovaScotiaGenealogy.com, it says that the range starts as early as 1830. On the Family Search database, it appears that this only goes as early as 1837. So I'm not entirely sure if it goes earlier and they've just missed some of them, or the database from Nova Scotia Archives is a little off on their start date. So I'm going to do that same search for Hugh Lambert and see what I get. Remember, the only way I could see it is to zoom right in, or if I zoomed it out to see the whole document, I couldn't quite clearly see it. But now through Family Search, I can see the actual whole document at one time. And then it says, I have examined a family Bible and find that record we're in. So this is the document that is going to be the application for Hugh's birth. Now, again, because of an agreement with Nova Scotia Archives, you can see this image, and what I've done is I've done a screen capture to capture it to show you. In this case, if you try to save the image, you're going to say that it is not allowed to be saved, but it is a lot easier to view the document this way than through the Nova Scotia Genealogy website. Now, going back to the other records, now we've searched for a birth that was a delayed registration. Let's try a birth for in the civil registration range of 1864 to 1877. So I'm going to do another Lambert search under birth. And on this case, I'm going to pick Catherine Lambert. This is within the first year of births being recorded of 1864 into 65, and I'm going to hit view. This is the birth register of 1865-66. So a lot of times the births are recorded in a dual range of years here. As you can see here, this is Kings County, 1865 to 66. It's a little blurry. And that's, again, this is one of the reasons of the zoom in, zoom out does not work as clearly as you would say through Family Search. But that being said, you can find this as well on FamilySearch.org. So here is the individuals that I would normally look for. I'm going to now do it through Nova Scotia. It also has Nova Scotia births and baptisms 1702 to 1896. And Nova Scotia births 1864 to 1877. So now I do my search for Lambert there. I can come across and find all of the different ones that I wanted to find. And there's a camera icon associated here, so then I can actually get the information I need and view the actual record. So in here I have the again, the contract restrictions of what is disabled, so I cannot download this. But as you can see, you can clearly see this is a little smaller, but you're able to zoom in and zoom out on the actual record itself. And this is a birth that occurred in the 1870s. Marriages 1864 to 1943 are available currently on Nova Scotia Genealogy. So we can do a search there and find in either sorted by year order, or you could sort by place, You can search by the bride's name or the groom's name. The nice thing about doing the search, you can see here is an Elizabeth Lambert marrying a James Frizzell. So either one of the two names should match up with your search criteria. And then, of course, just like the others, you hit view and you can actually pull up the record itself. One of the nice things about the early marriage records is it actually will give you the parents on the bride and the groom. So you get also that you get where they were born and their age. So you can kind of use some calculations to find when your ancestor and where your ancestor was born in Nova Scotia or elsewhere based upon their marriage records. The marriage records stayed continuous. So there was no break in 1877, and they did not end, and they went completely straight on through. So you can find over 80 years of these records on Nova Scotia genealogy. Other databases from Family Search that you may wish to consult are Nova Scotia Marriages 1711 to 1909, the Nova Scotia Marriages 1864 to 1918. That will be a duplicate of what you find on Nova Scotia Genealogy and will actually have the ledgers a little bit easier to read, like we looked at for the birth registers. And you can also find some other marriages for Nova Scotia from 1907 to 1932. Always click Learn More and find out the details of the particular records itself. Marriage licenses by county on microfilm at NEHGS. We have, again, the records that go from 1864 to 1918. We have some of the earlier marriage bonds. So between working with what's on Family Search, Nova Scotia Genealogy, and our microfilm, and of course with our microfilm, you can take some of those marriage ledgers, birth registers, and death registers and put them on your thumb drive and actually have a nice blown up clear image done from our microfilm. Nova Scotia Vital Records, again, just as a recap, begin in 1864. And the nice thing that's about the birth records is that you can often find the pre-1864 marriage date in place of the parents. That's why I'm inserting this here. So if you have a child born in 1866, for instance, the parents may have been married in 1857. It will actually sometimes give the full date as well as where the parents are married. It's proving the legitimacy of the child. And sometimes it's just the date and not a place. Sometimes it's a year, not a full date, but it's definitely worth looking at. And check out some of the non-consistency to their answers. 5 children, 5 different dates, 5 different places, not uncommon. Again, after 1877, the only marriages were recorded through 1908. And again, we have these on microfilm at NEHGS. We're going to talk about deaths now, covering 1864 to 77 and 1908 to 1968. Now, these are available from available somewhat from Family Search, but again, Nova Scotia Genealogy is going to be the place you can quickly go and find them. Again, with the limitations of the zoom in, zoom out, you can find registered deaths as early as the 1864 range. As you can see, some deaths here from 1869. You are going to get a limited amount of information. It tells you the sex of the person, their age, their condition, where they were born. Depending on who's recording the information, you sometimes will get parents, occupation of parents or their occupation, place of their death, and the certified cause of death. Again, it's really spotty early on, and sometimes you're going to get more from one county and less from another. So do search through them. And again, Family Search will have these microfilm as well. This particular one is from my great-great-grandfather, who had been married in 1824, dies in Halifax County in 1869. Now, the later records go from being on register records, where you're going to get about 20 to 40 names depending on the size of the ledger sheet, to actual certificates. This is a zoom of the entire image. Of course, I have to get closer, but I lose the whole screen of my great-grandmother's death in 1919. And that gives me a lot more information. It says where she was born, who her parents were, what she died from. Initially, Nova Scotia death records would blank out the cause of death, and that is also true with New Brunswick. But in recent years, they have released the availability of the cause of death. Of course, with the family health histories, with genealogy, it's an important thing to know what your family died from. Now, going through the records itself, I wanted to then show you that Nova Scotia deaths, 1890 to 1955, here's my great-grandfather's death in 1928, and I'm getting all the information, and it's a lot clearer. As you can even see, the small print is available, whereas if I tried to do that on the Nova Scotia genealogy site, I would only be getting portions of it available to look at. Nova Scotia death databases on Family Search include the Nova Scotia deaths 1864 to 77. It also includes some from Halifax between 1890 and 1908. Now that is because the city of Halifax kept their own death registers, not the county, but the city. So you may have some luck there. And then again, when all the deaths are resumed again, 1908 to 1955, and some continuation 1956 to 57. However, if you want 1958 to 1968 death records, the only place you're going to get that are from Nova Scotia genealogy currently. Now, if you're looking for more recent records, as of January 2020, death records 1970 to present, marriages 1945 to present, and births 1920 to present have to be purchased from the Vital Statistics office in Halifax. And that website down below here will give you the URL you need to place a request. You know, NEHCS, when we purchased microfilm, I decided that I would buy things that, well, go a little bit beyond the birth, marriages, and deaths. And a couple of these I want to show you. First off, we have on microfilm coroner's records. These coroner's records cover 1755 to 1928. Now, they were not on Family Search when we first bought them over a decade ago, but they are on 29 rolls of microfilm at NEHGS. But we also will allow you to be able to see them from home now because you can see them on Family Search. Give you an example of what they look like. Here is a coroner's record from 1791, an inquisition held on the body of Abigail Marsh on the road leading from Annapolis to Shelburne. And then later that month, to an inquisition held on the body of one woman and one child found on the road leading from Annapolis to Shelburne. So these are the coroner's inquisitions. Here's the coroner's signature and any cost involved into the investigation, burial, etc. Now, of course, not all marriages last forever. And we have on microfilm, as well as now available on Family Search, Nova Scotia divorce and matrimonial cases from 1759 to 1951, almost 200 years of divorce and separation support records. Here's an example of a divorce occurring in the 18th century in Nova Scotia, and it goes into all the details. If you want to know why the marriage has ended, this will give you every reason. May it be for having a marital affair, or maybe there was abuse. All of that will be laid out right in front of you. Probate records. For Nova Scotia, with the problem with not having a lot of death records between 1877 and 1908, and of course death records prior to 1864, turning to probate is going to be a valuable tool for you, because these records, in fact, are going to often tell you when the person has passed away. So at least you know when they wrote the will and when the will was proved. The Nova Scotia probate records that are on Family Search are over 1.3 million images, and they span 1760 to 1993. And this is actually even a little bit more than what we have on microfilm at NEHGS. So you can browse through these collections. And you can pick the county that you want. In this case, I've picked Cumberland. And each one of these hyperlinked in blue are the actual ranges of records. So you may have to go to an index to the actual wills first, and then it's going to tell you a particular docket number or a volume number that you need to go to. It is well worth it to spend some time going through the probate records for Nova Scotian families with the limits of vital records that are out there. But when you get into them in cases of having the actual probate case file, you'll find all sorts of things, between receipts as well as inventories to pretty much everything your ancestor had. From the saddles that they had, to the amount of horses they had, to sleds. It really gives you a look into the home and barn and outbuildings of your ancestor in the 18th through the early 20th century. Just to let you know what we do have at NEHGS for you, we have microfilm for the following counties of Annapolis, Antigonish, Cape Breton, Colchester, Cumberland, Digby, the Guysborough and St. Mary's district of Guysborough County. We also have Halifax, Hants, Inverness, Kings, Lunenburg, Pictou, Queens, Richmond, Shelburne, both districts of both the Barrington district and the Shelburne district, Victoria, and Yarmouth counties. And again, you can refer back to this or look at our catalog on AmericanAncestors.org for our film. Again, we don't have these online, but they are on microfilm from our collection. Talk a little bit about census records. Every province in Atlantic Canada has a different start-stop date on the censuses. In Nova Scotia, there were very early tax lists. In fact, I'm very lucky for where my family lived in Cumberland County, that there are tax rolls that go back into the 18th century. There is a great book that you should look at if you are at NEHGS or at Family Search Library or any place that has Nova Scotia microfilm by Thomas Hillman. It is known as a catalog of census returns on microfilm, 1666 to 1891, and that will give you a breakdown of what is available. There are some of these pre-1851 census records on the Library and Archives of Canada website, so you can see some of these digitized online. In 1851, Nova Scotia started its first provincial census. Now, the problem with that all that survives is Halifax, Kings, and Pictou counties. NEHGS has this, as well as you'll find it on Ancestry.com. This is going to be listed for each one of the decennial censuses, so I'll just talk a little bit about what they are, as you can see where they're located. You can probably already have searched this, but again, it's just the head of household. So it's not exactly the easiest thing, and of course, with only 3 counties, it makes it very tough. A decade later, in 1861, you'll find that the head of household is included, but with scores of agricultural data. These are amazing. These allow you to kind of see the amount of acres of salt marsh they have, woodlots, how many cows they have, how many bushels of corn they produce that year. It's almost like having a diary in 1861 for your ancestors' life. If they were in the seafaring trade, it will tell you how many barrels of cod they may have put away and put up that year. I mean, there's a variety of things you'll find, whether they're working class in the city or they're a farmer on hundreds of acres of land. In 1871, this is the first census for Nova Scotia that included all the names of the household. And this, of course, would continue throughout the remaining years of Nova Scotia. The nice thing about this one is that it gives this great information. You can finally start to see all those ones that you only had statistical information earlier. You can now see that you have the same family. You may also want to note that even though Nova Scotia is originally what was part of New Brunswick, in New Brunswick, the first census that lists all people in it, incidentally, is 1851. So in 1851 and 61, you're going to get everyone in the household. But for Nova Scotia, it's going to start in 1871. 1881, 1891, 1901, we have microfilm at NEHGS. It's also available on Ancestry.com. You can also find on the Library and Archives Canada and Ancestry, the 1911 and the 1921 census. The Archives of Canada also has free access to the 1851, 1871, and 1901 Nova Scotian census, and you can find those by going to the link I've provided below. Let's now talk about land records. And this will help you with kind of piecing together often when your ancestor arrived in Nova Scotia. What we have here are Nova Scotia land grants on family search, and this covers 1732 to 1864. Now, this is going to help you figure out if your ancestor got a crown land, but there are a variety of other different catalog entries for Nova Scotia land. You want to look at all of them, and I'm going to show you a few of them. Now, under this listing, it's essentially just a typescript. And if you relied specifically on looking at this one roll of microfilm, it's going to be useful for you because it's going to tell you the actual grant number, and it's sort of an abstract, but it's not the whole record itself. That's where you really need to turn to the Nova Scotia Crown Land Records themselves, the actual record books. And I'm going to show you an example of those. Now, the Crown Land Records, for instance, remember I talked about Cape Breton, the way it's separated was its own colony in 1820. So Cape Breton County has its own Crown Land Record. So if you're searching in Nova Scotia Crown Land and you don't find your Cape Breton countied families, definitely take a look at this collection. This is on 16 rolls of microfilm. All of the collections that I've been talking about are actually also available on microfilm from NEHGS, so if you happen to be at our library to view them. Now, this is an example of a particular grant that exists, and these are kind of fun because you get both the description of the property and you're also finding, of course, who it's being granted to. You use the index ahead of time. You can go clearly to these records, and then you can actually often get a plot. Now, this plot itself is going to show you where the actual grant has been set up and who the abutters are. So you may find other people also receiving the grant at a particular time, and I'll show an example of that as well. Now, Nova Scotia deeds in Halifax County, for instance, you can now look, you know your ancestor got a grant, but how about if you don't find one, but you know for certain that they owned the property? There are deeds digitized for all the counties in Nova Scotia available for you on Family Search. So we're going to view these actual digital images. You can click here. And you can go in county by county. So in this case, I'm going to search Cumberland County and see if my ancestors' property was there. The grantor and grantee index goes back and forth, so I can see all of these properties that my third great grandfather purchased. And as you can see, the range of years, 1844, 1821, 1803, 1795, 94. That 1794 property, when he purchases from Mary Cannon, is the earliest piece of property my family is in. And also keep in mind that the spelling of your ancestor's name, it's the same family name here, John Lambert, and John Stewart is actually the same person my ancestor is. So keep in mind that spellings of names are not always consistent, even if they're common names. So what I was grand to find out here is the original deed of my ancestor back in 1793, recorded in 94, had other people in the actual deed itself. So I was able to use that as clues to where we came from in Ireland. And our last name, Lambert, is recorded here as Lampart. But if it's an actual name that kind of, the sounding of it can sound just back and forth, and Lamperts and Lamberts are pretty much the same name. So in this case, my John Lambert may have been a John Lambert to begin with. Crown land records. So now I know the fact that my ancestor is buying land in the 1790s. Did he in fact get crown land? So I went a little further into the family search databases and searched for this. The Crown land records have a series of over 140 maps showing the locations of Crown land between 1750 and 1850. And you can look at this and download the maps from the government of Nova Scotia. And these are great details. The problem is that your ancestor may have sold their Crown land, and the more recent person who occupied it may be who is written on the map. So you need to do a little bit of title search from your ancestor, see if who he sold it or transferred it to. These Crown land maps are really easy to use. All you have to do is hover over the section that you're looking for and click on the square. And up comes a map with the detail. Now this is kind of give you a view of the actual entire community, but you get the names of all different grantees and you can zoom right in on it. And as you can see, there's a little bit of overlapping done or corrections when there are new occupiers. So this at least will give you a geographical sense of where your ancestor lived. And guess what? Now you can use Google Earth and zoom in and see what there is there now. Nova Scotia Crown land records. NEHGS has these maps available. So if you come to NEHGS, we have them. Ask at the 4th floor reference desk. We will bring them out and you can lay them out on a table and you can use your digital camera and zoom right into the detail that you want. We also have the Crown land grant registers, and that covers roughly 1732 to 1901. And we also have the documentation relating to Crown land grants 1854 to 1967. These are also microfilm that we have at NEHGS on the 4th floor. But let's take a look at the Crown land grant registers on Family Search. So I was able to go into the list of the grants, and I found that in 1812, with a few other people, my John Lambert got part of 5,200 acres in McCann and Five Islands. Now, Five Islands is a road that leads through McCann itself. So this is along the road itself, and I was really excited about this. And it told me that it was in Book C and that it was image 20. It was a little hard to read that initially. It's essentially 20 then the pound sign, not 204. But then I was able to go into Book C, and then I found the actual grant itself. Unfortunately, it doesn't bring me any closer to where in Ireland we come from, but this is a really nice early Crown land, and it actually talks about where some of the parcels were later transferred in the 1950s and sold to a lumber company. My ancestors' property was 300 acres, and the plot map is there as well. And the nice thing is you can zoom right in on the plot map once you look at it on Family Search, and it gives you the actual detail. So let's take a peek at that map. And here's my John Lambert, 300 acres of land, and there's the road. Now here's all the abutters. So I want to do fan research on all of these people and see who they are and see if he buys and sells land back and forth. So this was a really important clue for my to confirm my later research, because at this point, when I had located this, I knew that I was looking for Lamberts in Cumberland County. I know that this John Lambert showed up early and that he was on this road to the Five Islands in Cumberland County in the village of McCann. So I was, at that point in my research, just collecting information. How did this John Lambert tie into my James Albert Lambert, who died in 1928? And that's what I'm going to talk more about in my case study that we get towards the end. Nova Scotia land papers are also something you can search, and this is often petitions for the land grants and any particular documents that may have been where the land is being brought to court. You sometimes will find those where disputes over land boundaries. So look at these records here. These are available from the Nova Scotia Archives website. And these land papers, you can search basically by the name itself, and it covers 1765 to 1800. So it's very early, but they are in color. So if you pull up and you did a search on an individual, each one of the documents is showed in a thumbnail version, but once you click on it, the actual full document will be there, and you can right-click and save it. Unlike the Nova Scotia genealogy, these land maps and papers are available. You'll also find some of the early Nova Scotia census records prior to 1851 available here as well. Some of those tax lists. So here's the actual record of John Johnson from Shelburne County. No doubt this is a person who is one of the loyalists who's settling in Shelburne, getting his license to occupy the property. Cape Breton land petitions. Again, Cape Breton being separate until 1820 from Nova Scotia. The land petitions for them are very much in detail because it tells you where the person came from beforehand, which is not the case for a lot of the Nova Scotia land petitions. So these are from 1787 to 1843 and may give you that clue for your early Scottish settlers in Cape Breton. And these records, again, can be used and searched on the Nova Scotia Archives website. And very, very useful and free database. Just as an example, I pulled up the last name, Lambert. No relationship to me. Unfortunately, this George Lambert is there and has a plot of land. There's another petition for George Lambert. And then there's a James Lambert who I thought may have been connection to mine early on. But the nice clue is that he named his plot of land Cavan. I thought to myself, great, I know what county they came from. Yeah, that turned out not to be my relative, unfortunately. But when you're collecting a surname in a colony or a province that has not a lot of early records, you start to want to piece them all together and then rule out at the end. Now, I talked about maps before, the Crown Land Grant maps. In the 1860s, A.F. Church produced a series of maps right down to the farm level. So you can see the dot where the farm is located on the road. These are great. We have these on microfilm on the 4th floor, and these are available for you to Again, the Ambrose F. Church maps were commissioned for the point of actually being one step beyond the Crown land grants, and it gives you that extra detail and is worked in conjunction with the 1871 census. You can actually go down and see the detail of the farm. It's a little hard to see from this view right here, but the detail of all of these areas here are actually all the names of the families that appear on the map. Nova Scotia periodicals that are available. I thought I'd share some of those with you. The Nova Scotia Historical Review, we have those at NEHGS from 1981 to 1996, as well as the publication for the Nova Scotia Genealogist, covering from 1983 to the present. These are located on the 5th floor stacks at NEHGS in Boston. Newspapers. There are actually some Nova Scotia newspapers available from the archive, available online. So I'm going to talk to you about those a bit. Those might be useful for you. And those, again, from the Nova Scotia archives, they've put some of the earliest of the newspapers available, dating back to the Halifax Gazette in 1752. You can browse the newspapers itself and go issue by issue and pull up each one. These are browsable versus not searchable like you would normally do through, say, newspapers.com or Genealogy Bank. But if you have very early people dying in Nova Scotia or transferring land or in a court proceeding, why not take a look at the newspapers? Or better yet, understand what's going on in Nova Scotia on the weekly news when your ancestor lived there in the 18th century or early 19th century. Now, this isn't the only set of newspapers, the early 1700s. As you can see, a list on the right, and I made it a little bit easier. You can actually zoom right in and go page by page right into the records. And again, you can save these images and they're done in color, which makes the contrast really easy to use. Now, this is just a listing, and you can refer back to it. These are some of the newspapers that are available from the Nova Scotia archives, and you want to check, of course, the coverage for the newspaper, as well as the time frame that the newspaper is recorded. One of the newspapers that we actually have at NEHGS on microfilm is called The Casket, and that covers some great newspaper stories dealing with the Pictou area of Nova Scotia. Some of the NEHGS databases I had mentioned earlier, the Crowell's New Englanders to Nova Scotia, but I thought I'd talk about a couple of the other ones that we have. We have the Barrington and Argyll, Nova Scotia vital records, and this is a great one, especially if your family is early settlement up there in Barrington and Argyll. Again, after the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, you're going to get early settlements up there. And these records are also very useful because Barrington is one of the ones settled by New England planters and loyalists. And Argyll's settlement was put in 1771. So you're going to get some early family histories. So in a lot of cases, the vital records, remember those township book records I talked about? A lot of people carried the information of their births, marriages, and deaths back in New England and brought them when they came up to Nova Scotia. So sometimes you get dates that predate the settlement of the community itself, but which is a great connector, because if you find a name and date here, and you can connect it back to a family from Cape Cod or Connecticut or wherever, you now have that almost link, if you will, back to New England. Is an example of some of the records itself. The handwriting might seem a little familiar to you because it was transcriptions that were done by Fred Crowell for his New Englanders to Nova Scotia series. So he went through a lot of the township books and he's made different notes in here. But again, this collection is available from American Ancestors for you to use as a member. I'm going to give you a case study. The hardest part of genealogy for me over the years was to try to figure out where my Lambert family came from. My father had always said that we were from Nova Scotia, and well, sure enough, we were. But where? The biggest problem that I had is that my great-grandfather, who died in 1928 at the age of 82 in Sydney, Nova Scotia, had a full death record. In fact, there's some good clues there. Or as I thought they were good clues. Well, all I could figure out is that he was born about 1846 and that he was born in Nova Scotia. I was able to find that my great-grandfather was a carpenter and an architect and moved around. I would find out that he lived in Truro, Nova Scotia for a while, but For a while, he was in the island of Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon. And in the 1990s, there was a fire. But one of the small censuses that was done on the island of Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon mentioned my great-grandfather was born in New Scotland in the island, rather in the county, starting with the letter C. So I narrowed it down that it had to be Colchester or Cumberland, and that the letter formation looked like it would have ended with a D and not an R. So I was betting on Cumberland County. That would be a really good guess, and that's where I moved forward to in my research. But the death record gave me not many good clues, other than it says his father was born in Cumberland County. So that verified it a second time. But I want to take a closer look at this information. So my great-grandfather's name was James Albert Lambert, or sometimes James Albert George Lambert. So here I've got the Cumberland County. So wow, it says his father is James Albert Lambert. But here's the problem. It also says his mother's name is Sabine Lambert. Well, that was the name of my great-grandfather's wife, Sabina or Sabine Pike, and that she was born in Newfoundland. Then I realized that the informant, my great-uncle, didn't give his father's parents, he gave his own parents. So this is my great-grandfather's name, my great-grandmother's name, but the one clue is he did give is that his dad was born in Cumberland County, Nova Scotia. So that's where I started to look. One problem, he was born in 1846, 18 years before they started recording them. There is no census of 51. The 1861 is agricultural. By 71, he's 25 years old and completely out of the household. What was I going to look at next? Well, what I started doing is backtracking, knowing that my great-grandfather lived in Colchester County, and I knew that he moved to Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon. I thought I'd look at deeds. One of the deeds would unlock a great mystery. So I go down and I look at Colchester County, Nova Scotia deeds, and for he was living in Truro. And there's a deed he does here in 1874 in Truro. Then I notice one that doesn't have a location, which seemed kind of strange. So they were both in the same volume, so I made myself the avail of looking at those volumes. Again, they are now on Family Search. I looked at them on microfilm initially. So I pulled up that deed. This deed in 1874 was land from John Lambert to James Lambert. Now, the interesting thing here is that it gives the description of the deed itself. It is a description for land in McCann on the road to Five Islands. Remember I had mentioned that before, that 1812 Crown land? That's the same property. So this is combined, but this is now a 600-acre lot. Now, the best part of it is that I, John Lambert, for consideration of the natural love and affection of his son, the said James Lambert. Now I have a connection. My great-grandfather in Truro, Nova Scotia, is getting land deeded to him by his father, John Lambert. Now, I did a little research on that John Lambert, and I thought to myself, I didn't see one living in Truro, Nova Scotia in 1871 in the census. It's because when he signed his deed in 1869, when he was living in Halifax County, in the city of Halifax, Nova Scotia, this was done on his deathbed. So we now have the confirmation of James being the son of John, and we now know that the connection with that earlier John Lambert, who turned out to be the grandfather of my great-grandfather James, getting the crown land in 1812. So I've got two generations now confirmed. The puzzling thing is, why was there not a town name given on that county deed in Colchester? Because when James Lambert was living in Colchester, he is registering a deed written in Halifax for land in Cumberland County. So if I ever looked for this deed in Cumberland County, I would have never found it. In fact, as soon as my great-grandfather goes to record this deed in 1874, he then transfers it to somebody else. So he takes his inheritance and then he moves elsewhere in Nova Scotia and then ultimately to Saint-Pierre. So this deed both gave me the parentage of my ancestor as well as confirming of a location of an earlier generation. So I always puzzled myself. I had spent some time at the Nova Scotia archives, as I had mentioned, church records. I looked through church records. I figured he's born in 1846. He's probably going to be born about 46, 47, 45. And I looked from 1840 to 1850 through baptisms for dozens upon dozens of churches of all different faiths. Never could find him. Well, I found out that John Lambert, my great-great-grandfather, when he was in Halifax, he was actually a merchant or a trader. Well, let's go to the next image. This was browsing through St. George's Anglican Church in Parsborough. Parsborough is right down the road from where that property was that my great-great-great-grandfather got in 1812, and my great-grandfather is deeding in 1874. And in the Anglican Register of St. George's Parish, on the July the 28th, James Albert Lambert, the son of John, and doesn't give his wife's name, who was Margaret McDade, incidentally. Remember from my 1824 marriage that I had showed you. It says that he's living in Mill Village, which is right outside of Parsborough, and the occupation of the father is a trader. Now, this is in 1860. If you notice on each one of these different records here, there's a number written, 7, 14, 16. So in 1860, a 14-year-old child named James Albert Lambert. If you subtract 82 years from 1928, you have 1846. This is the baptism of my great-grandfather when he was a teenager, but it confirms the lineage. And later years after that, I confirmed with other descendants of John Lambert via Y-DNA, and I have my match. I hope that this has given you some insight as to what you can do with Nova Scotia records, both at home or when you're visiting NEHGS, or perhaps even when you get out on a chance to go to Nova Scotia. Perhaps maybe you'll go with us sometime. I also want to extend personal thanks to my colleague and friend, Melanie McComb, who helped me out with the immigration chapter when I wasn't feeling so well earlier this month. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the next presentation and continue to research your Atlantic Canadians. There's so much to be found. Thank you very much.